Hello, my name's Mono-Logues, and this is Mono-Logues. It's not a fact that I've chosen to share in the past, but the first decade of my adult life was intertwined, in all sorts of ways, with that of Elliot Gleave, who for many years was better known to audiences around the world as the musician Example. For reasons that will hopefully make more sense as we go on, I've decided that it's time to discuss everything. Our friendship, what happened afterwards, and the circumstances that turned him into the man you know. Shortly after my 18th birthday, I dropped out of college and joined the army. I'd been wholly overrated as a student throughout my years of schooling, and it had finally caught up with me across my GCSEs and AS exams. Adrift in a sea of B's, C's and D's, it seemed clear that there was nothing meaningful or enticing, or even just interesting, within the conventional pathways open to me. It was almost a thoughtless thing, just getting up and making that step without really considering the ramifications of it. In so many ways, I was not living an engaged life. I felt like a drunken figure skater, with the guile and the wit to stay mobile, but no motive, no direction, just chaotic movement. 6 months later, I was in Afghanistan, and I woke up. Even as I stepped off the plane, I realised that I had made a catastrophic error. The baking heat, the beige square buildings, the faces of the men and women around me. I'd fucked up. I've never really been a brave person. I don't take a lot of risks, and I'm broadly not interested in dying for any particular cause, especially one as nebulous and misguided as the Allied campaign in 2008. I didn't really talk to anyone at first. You'd have a bit of small talk with people you were working with that day. Where are you from? How long have you been here? That kind of thing. But I didn't really talk to the guys I was living with that much. I just felt like a bit of an outcast. I was able to compartmentalize things for a while, just in terms of we're doing patrols, we're clearing roads methodically, we're doing some piecework. This is not safe, but it's not front line, I'm not being sent into combat, not that war really works like that in a lot of the modern scenarios. I'd cut off contact with my parents and school friends, again for reasons that were difficult to pinpoint. So there was this loneliness there, this deep, deep loneliness. Two things changed: the explosion and meeting Elliot. I was riding into Lashkargah when an explosion rocked our car, the right side lifting up and slamming back down. The vehicle in front of us had triggered an IED, and it was completely destroyed, the 4 people inside killed in an instant. I was lucky to be alive. There was a strange kind of forced joviality that night, back at the camp. Moments of danger and tragedy seemed to bring forth strange emotions from the others. But I was crazed almost. I started thinking about trying to get reassigned, at feigning madness, even at going AWOL, though I couldn't face up to the prospect of military prison. While the rest of the barracks were congregating in the communal areas or talking in their bunks, I wandered the sleepy corners of the camp, pacing incessantly, this yawning horror threatening to overwhelm me. Far from anyone else, in a distant corner of the camp, I heard something. The strum of a guitar. I stopped, and the noise stopped too. There were these crates all around me that appeared to be a solid wall, but upon closer inspection hid this small corner, which I turned, and in the dim light I saw Elliot for the first time. He was sat on a crate, his legs dangling below, holding a battered acoustic guitar and staring right at me. I remember very clearly, he didn't say, "What are you doing here?" or "What do you want?" He just beckoned me in with an extended hand, and so, for whatever reason, I joined him, sitting up on a plastic drum. He started to play something that I obviously was unaware of at the time, but would later go on to be Won't Go Quietly. He played a few songs from the first album to me that night, just a few, and then we started talking. He'd recognised me, seen me reading here and there. "That's rare," he said. I shrugged. I was a little embarrassed. We ended up talking into the early hours, about our lives, the reasons we'd enlisted, our hopes and worries. He was someone who you felt like you could talk to about anything. He was cool, even that night when it was just the two of us. But I got the feeling that he would take me seriously, that he was genuinely interested in what I had to say. We became friends, and through him I met the few others on the base who were more my types. Many of them, like me, had found themselves frazzled by their adolescence and stepped off that plane into the sand with the dawning realization that they had made a major choice, good or bad. Elliot was the de facto leader of our little gang, but things were looser than that, and it gave me a place to eat, people to talk to share things with. I felt more of a certainty then that I was going to get through things, that I would keep my head down, not do anything foolish, bide my time, and go home. The barracks was distinctly male, and the locals were broadly unavailable, which made the few women within the unit, or those visiting in other roles, objects of much attention. There was a kind of chauvinism to it that I found quite uncomfortable, heightened by the constant masturbation that you would stumble upon at all hours of the day. About a month after I met Elliot, he introduced me to Tracy, a visiting journalist with whom I ended up losing my virginity. She was a writer at magazine, and I managed to impress her enough with my knowledge of the wider context around the war to win over her reservations about my age, though the succinctness of our encounter all but rubber-stamped that it would not be repeated. Looking back, those months were one of the few times in my life that I really felt a sense of belonging. But things are about to change. It was late, and Elliot and I were returning from an FOB, driving one of the snatch Land Rovers. It was right before they got rid of them, and I would always brick it the whole time I was in one. Suddenly, we saw a brilliant blue light above us, far brighter than any star in the sky. Elliot slowed the car and we stepped out, checking around us before looking up, or quickly turning to panic as the light moved, growing in size and darting in these quick bursts from side to side. I knew from its movement that it wasn't a comet or an asteroid, but for a moment I wondered if we were seeing a secretive test of some sort. A new plane, reconnaissance craft, drone, whatever. The growing shape and speed of it quickly put that idea to rest. It was never bigger than the end of a pencil to us, but it was clearly a craft, a few kilometers up in the sky. It seemed spherical from our limited perspective, but I'd struggled to specify much beyond that. Certainly it didn't get close enough that I could describe it in any detail, draw it, give any insight into its shape or material. Elliot and I watched the craft dart across the sky for about a minute, and then, with a brief flash, again, of bright blue, it disappeared entirely. Without really acknowledging it, we got back in the car and he started driving. We rode in silence for 20 minutes, then, slowing as we approached the base, he turned to me and said, "We can't tell anyone about this." I was confused. We started a kind of argument, but we'd arrived before it really went anywhere. I recognized immediately that we had seen something that proved that there was life beyond Earth, or, well, proved that we were being visited, observed maybe. I said that others must have seen it, other troops or locals. "We can't fucking talk about this, Oliver," is all he said, something changing in his eyes. For whatever reason I obeyed his instructions, though things were off suddenly, in ways everyone in our group had spotted. Elliot, normally seen at various points throughout the day strumming on his guitar or whistling, was silent, sullen. The two of us didn't talk much, as if he were avoiding me, when all I wanted to do was discuss what we'd seen. A week or so later I was on patrol in a local town, and, In my most broken diary, I started to ask a few of the locals if they'd seen anything. I pointed to the sky, held my finger like the craft, and darted it back and forth. They were confused by my questions, or didn't want to answer. I tried again the next week, using a dictionary to put together clearer questions, but still I got nothing from the people I spoke to. A few days later I was reading in my bunk when an officer I'd seen but never spoken to tapped me on the shoulder and asked me to follow him. Across the multi-hour interrogation that followed, it became clear that several locals had complained to army translators about a gangly Englishman asking them about lights in the sky, that they had been upset or annoyed, and that this complaint had reached its way back to the base, where a certain fellow private had confirmed it, had said that I was claiming we'd seen a spaceship together when no such thing had happened, had said that I was crazy, obsessed. I saw Elliot as I was being led from the office, sat 30 or so meters away, staring into space. He didn't see me. I was dishonorably discharged from the army, though due to the nature of the complaint I wasn't prosecuted. Instead I was simply put on a succession of flights, some filled with jovial soldiers returning home, others half empty, and within a few days I was back in England. I'd not spoken to anyone from my old life for 15 months. I was 19, lost, and deeply angry. On a whim, I took a train to Sheffield and moved into a shared flat, which I paid for in cash, an illegal sublet I shared with half a dozen others. I started working in the kitchens of a local pub, washing dishes, mopping floors, prepping microwave curries and flat-pack burgers. I was asocial, miserable. I spent much of my free time researching UFOs, but something kept me from reaching out about my experiences, some twisted shame from what had happened. I told no one about my time in the army, about my life before. I had no goals, nothing I wanted. This fugue continued for about a year. One time, my manager called me a retard on an evening shift and I broke his nose, but I found another pub, another rotating group of colleagues to ignore me. Radio 1 was on a lot in the kitchen, and as this was the end of the 2000s, it was playing an interesting mix of some fairly ropey pop music, the last gasps of the indie boom, one of the weaker eras of American rap, and a few aging bands from the late 90s onwards. I remember, one day, that I was frying several burgers, just about the only edible thing on the menu, thinking to myself, where do I know this song from? It took me until the second chorus to realise that it was Elliot, and it was a song he'd played for me that first night, what seemed like a lifetime ago. Won't Go Quietly was an immediate hit, and Kickstarts, another song he'd often play for us, followed soon after. Something in me cracked. I felt completely adrift and abandoned. I felt like there was nothing for me in the world. I was also angry. So fucking angry at him for what he'd done to me. I didn't know what to do about it, about my life. So, I started to use heroin. I'd been doing drugs anyway, coke to wake me up, weed to help me sleep, MCAT, 2CB, speed, whatever else I could get to occupy my evenings and days off. I think a lot of people who do heroin slide into it through groups, through their circle, through the actions of others. That niggling feeling of one time won't hurt. For me, it was a spontaneous, independent, inexplicable impulse, just like joining the army. I'd love to say here and now that I found no solace in the needle, but the truth is that it washes away everything. There is nothing else, no worries, no pressure, no structure, no future, nothing. When I was on heroin, I wasn't bothered about Elliot's career, about the example songs I heard through car windows and supermarket sound systems. I wasn't bothered that I had no friends, that I was estranged from my family, that I couldn't hold a job. Cognizant that regular shift work no longer fitted my lifestyle, I started stealing things to sell, handbags at train stations, DVDs in Smiths, steaks from supermarkets. I became good at it, washing and grooming myself in preparation so that I wouldn't arouse suspicion, rotating through locations to avoid being remembered, learning camera placements and lines of visibility for staff. When it came to scoring, I was thorough, methodical. For the first time in 20 years, I lived with purpose. At times, Elliot would creep into my little hermetic world. I'd see his face from the CD racks, hear his voice through supermarket speakers, spot posters and magazine covers. I'd swallow down my anger until I got home, then let go of it, cleanse myself at that altar. This went on for some time. Elliot disappeared and reappeared on different songs I'd not heard before. He looked different. His hair, his clothes, all traces of the warmth and heart that had defined him seemed to have been erased. I kept shooting up, kept stealing from different shops, though it was getting harder. There were scrapes, nights spent in cells, desperate sprints from security guards. I got kicked out of my flat and moved into what would probably be referred to as a drug house, which, in all honesty, was basically the same as my previous accommodation. I willed myself to let go, to loosen my grip and float away from the obligations of life. And then I bumped into Elliot. I was dressed in a shirt, as I had just stolen a dozen charms from the Pandora store. Truthfully, the shirt smelt and wasn't ironed. My standards had been slipping, something I was dimly aware of. But I wasn't a down and out, at least not visibly. There was this big crowd inside the shopping centre that I saw as an opportunity to disappear from any security who might be following me. The throng was mostly teenage girls, with a few mothers and fathers scattered about. My plan was to circumvent whatever their focal point was and emerge on the other side, but being a head taller than anyone else in the crowd, I quickly saw the object of their attention. Elliot was sat at a small table, with 2 security guards on either side of him. He was signing things, CDs, magazines, and taking the occasional picture with some of the teenagers. He had sunglasses on, and looked like he wanted to top himself. I stopped, staring down at him, only a few meters away. I was about to turn and leave when he spotted me. For a second he looked up, frozen, as if in shock. Then he stood, said, "Sorry guys, I'll be back in 5. And moved through the crowd towards me. He was friendly, calm, asking me to wait for an hour and meet him in a pub round the corner. I sat there, nursing a pint, Pandora charms jingling in my pocket. I thought that he wouldn't show, that he had fobbed me off for fear that I would cause a scene, but no, he arrived, removing his sunglasses to show his bloodshot eyes as he sat opposite me at the table. "Look," he said, after a pause. "I fucked up, okay? That's all there is to it." I blinked. I wasn't capable of engaging with what we saw at that point, and I knew that you were. I don't know. I thought they were going to get us both sent home. He sighed. "It's the biggest regret of my life, I promise you." Things started uneasily, but we began to talk. He was supplying me with pints, and even though the itch was starting to creep up within me, I held out. "I didn't tell anyone what we saw until I came home," he said. "Even then I found it excruciating. I thought they were going to laugh at me. But we're not alone, not even in the army. I've met lots of ex-squaddies who saw similar things across Afghanistan, who are still seeing them, and..." He pulled out an iPhone, which I'd never really seen up close before, opening a series of blurry photos. "Look, Iraq, Libya, Yemen. Wherever we go, they appear, whoever they are. He put the phone down. "I've been trying to contact them. That's what all the songs are about." I asked him what he meant. "I don't want the government to figure it out, so I have to be subtle, but I've included, lyrical references, code words, hidden audio files through all my songs. So in Won't Go Quietly, I've encoded the date and location of our sighting in Morse code, which plays over the bridge. Or in Shot Yourself in the Foot Again, if you take the second letter of the third word in every line, it spells out our base name. I asked him if he'd heard anything. I'm looking for signals everywhere, all day, but it's difficult to know what's a signal and what's not. Like, me becoming example. Is that a signal? Has some lever been pulled to make that happen? Am I being set up with something? And why? What about the others? I asked. The ones who were talking about it aren't doing too good, he said. I don't know why, but it's really affecting them. I think the light may have done something to us. Do you think that? I'd spent so long running from what had happened that I had no answer. Had the craft sent me on this path? Or had Elliot? Eventually, he asked me what I was up to, and I told him a series of lies that he seemed to buy. I didn't mention the squat, or the heroin, or the long-term unemployment, or that this was the longest I'd spoken to another person in more than a year. After accepting my story, he excused himself to go to the toilet, and I sat there staring at his iPhone, lying face down on the table. The seconds ticked by and I grabbed it, dashing through the door and out onto the street. Weirdly, the iPhone helped me get clean. I pawned it for £200, which I used to buy a train ticket, and the next day I turned up at my parents' door with nothing to my name, almost 3 years to the day that I'd last seen them. They packed me off to rehab, and after about a month that I literally cannot remember, I emerged, clean and ready to find something, anything, to do with my life. I lived in my parents' spare room and got a job in a restaurant, working my way up the ladder, staying off the drugs, drinking, but not to a crazy level. I remained a closed book. I wouldn't say people really warmed to me. I mentioned the army, if asked, acknowledged periods of unemployment, but no heroin, no spaceships. When I saw Example on the TV or heard him on the radio, it no longer made me livid. I felt a distance, really. Our reunion had shattered a lot, had clarified things, but I hadn't really forgiven him. Not that I wanted what he had, the screaming teenagers and the partying and the seemingly all-consuming paranoia. I wasn't sure what to make of his pronouncements that he was being watched, sculpted. To me, there were more logical explanations, that whatever we saw utilized desert areas, the Middle East. I never shook the belief that we had glimpsed something outside of this earth, but I wasn't convinced of some grand purpose linking us to it in the way Elliot seemed to be. Our paths didn't cross again for 2 years. In that time I'd remained healthy and had become a bit more outgoing, though I still lived with my parents, still worked antisocial shifts in the restaurant. Then, one fateful day in June 2013, as you'll no doubt remember, the asteroid 523 Apollo was first spotted by astronomers, who predicted with a high degree of certainty that it would collide with London just over a year later, on August 4th, 2014. There was a lot of panic initially, even though, at 350 meters in diameter, 523 Apollo would not cause an extinction-level event. What it would do, however, was all but level London and its surrounding areas. The response was colossal. At first, the focus was on things, strangely, with paintings, statues, pilfered treasures and more secured, boxed and sent across the country. Then, more slowly, residents within the 50-mile radius of the impact site were relocated, with many being sent to Brighton. Once London was empty and everything of value that could be removed had been, the army moved in, erecting a boundary line around the empty city, which thousands of troops patrolled day and night. It was all people talked about, even far away from the danger zone in Brighton. I remember my elderly neighbour telling me that she planned to spend the night in the park in case her house fell down during the impact. There was a tension to life, for everyone, which just kept ratcheting up as the final weeks arrived. 2 days before impact, I was locking up after a late finish, hanging by the back door while Gemma, who ran front of house, finished her cigarette, when a woman approached the two of us. It took me a few seconds to recognise Tracy, who had this strange smile and initiated a hug, despite the fact that I barely knew her, that 6 years had passed since our last meeting, and that it was utterly baffling that she'd found me. Gemma looked amused and sauntered off, leaving me with Tracy, who started asking me to come and look at something very insistently. I managed to get a few questions in, and she eventually said that she was working on a story about Example. For whatever reason, I followed her, round the corner and down an alleyway. As I emerged, a metre or so behind her, I felt a small pinprick in my shoulder, continuing on and then lurching, stumbling for a few steps, and collapsing onto a patch of grass. I woke up in a storage container, lit by a single bulb. I was tied to a chair, my vision swirling violently before finally coming into focus on the two figures in front of me. Elliot had shaved his head and was wearing a tracksuit. Tracy was sat on a chair in the back corner, watching me. Elliot smiled, held out his hands. I can explain everything. At first it was hard to really hang on to what he was saying, but finally he opened a rucksack leaning against the wall of the container and pulled out a sheaf of papers. I told you I was waiting for a sign. Well, I found it. He held them in front of me, and I recognized that each page appeared to be printed out from the internet, from Wattpad, which I wasn't aware of at the time, but later found out was a website for amateur fiction, mostly fan fiction or genre stuff, much of it written by teenagers. One of the pages had the cover of a book, which was crudely photoshopped and featured a photo of Elliot in the title. You Don't Have to Say Nothing, an Example fan fiction. I remember saying, "What the fuck is this, Elliot?" Maybe the first coherent sentence I'd managed since waking up. Hey, he said. "Don't call me Elliot. Don't call me Elliot. That's not my name." He started to flick through the pages in a frenzy. Each one was covered in highlighter marks and spidery notations. "Look, it's pretending to be one thing, but it's something else, just like my songs. Look," he was pointing at a line in the story. "I had never felt so special. I never thought that I would get with Example, even just for a night. It seemed impossible. I felt like the luckiest person in the whole of the universe." "See," he said, flicking more and pointing. "Basically, when we were on holiday in Spain, I met Example and we started seeing each other, and then he left, and then we left. Now I'm pregnant," I tell her, and she just looks at me in shock. See, he said. I told him that I had no idea what he was talking about. "Everything is a clue, everything. May 23rd we saw the craft. Look," he rifled, 23 pages, and the character, look." He pointed at a page with a synopsis. 23-year-old May's life is turned upside down when she finds out that she's pregnant as a result of a holiday romance with hot English musician, Example. And the whole thing is full of stuff that no one knows. Whoever wrote this couldn't have known. Like, look. He flicked to another page where Example, the character, whose description didn't really match the frenzied, sleepless man hurling papers around in front of me, took May to see Ted in the cinema. "Where are we?" I said. "Why have you fucking kidnapped me, Elliot?" "I haven't." He stopped himself. "This was the only way. You'll understand everything, I promise. And don't call me Elliot. My name is Example." He dropped every page on the floor, except one, which he held to me. "You are invited to the wedding of Elliot and May Gleave, June 13th, 2013. I gulped, predicting his logic for the first time. This was published in October 2012, months before any of the scientists saw anything. It's a prediction. And, I said, dreading what would come next. And that's why we're here, because we were invited. Invited to where? He smiled, turning to Tracy and back to me. To the center of it all. Don't you get it, Oliver? 5/23, Apollo. The date we saw them, and Apollo, the god of music. They're reaching out to us. We need to be there to meet them. Where the fuck are we? I said. He nodded to Tracy, who, with some effort, opened the container door onto a field, bordered by a thicket of trees, and, behind them, the distant landmarks of the London skyline. "It's going to be a hell of a show," Elliot said, following Tracy from the container. I knew then and there that we were far too close, that we must be dozens of miles inside the military line, that unless I could escape there was a high chance that I would die from the impact itself. I pulled and pushed at the knots tying me to the chair, but nothing shifted. I started to rock from side to side, eventually dropping onto my left shoulder, screaming in pain as it hit the metal floor. I lay there, watching night turn to day through the door. Just as I was about to give up and piss myself, Elliot finally returned, dashing over and righting the chair, seeming genuinely apologetic as he cut the ropes loose. I stood up to him. I wasn't sure whether to try and fight him or just to make a run for it, but he held out his hands and said, "It's too late." I gulped, then followed him out onto the field. "How far away are we?" I said. "It's safe. I did the math," he said, walking over to a car parked outside the container where Tracy was looking at her phone. He looked down at her screen and back to me. "Any minute now. We need to be the first people to reach the site." Tracy got out of the car and went and stood next to Elliot, who took her hand. I was a few meters behind them, looking up at the sky. I don't need to remind you of that brilliant blue streak, the scream that nearly ruptured my eardrums, the flames that streaked over me and smashed behind the trees, the rupture of fire and ash, the shock that threw me to the floor, pushed the air from my lungs, broke my wrist and shattered my glasses. It was the strangest thing. Bleeding and dazed, I watched from the floor as the dust settled, revealing that the skyline of London was gone, just like that. Elliot and Tracy were sat there too, dazed, staring at the trees. The Land Rover was to my left, and I slowly righted myself before stumbling towards it, looking through the broken window to see the keys sat in the ignition. I gulped, then slowly opened the door and clambered in. I turned the key, realizing with a jolt of pain that my hand was probably broken. Resting my elbow against the wheel, I put the car in first and slammed the pedal, all adrenaline and impulse. I didn't even look back to see if they were chasing me. I just drove, away from them and as far away from London as I could get. That was the last time I ever saw Elliot in person. I've never seen Tracy again. I sent him an email afterwards laying everything out, that I thought he was crazy, that I never wanted to see him again, that I could ruin him with what I knew. And he kept to that. I thought for a long time that the reason for this was that the large, plain rock that impacted London had punctured certain delusions he was maintaining. But, over time, I came to realize that it wasn't that at all. The complete opposite, in fact. Whatever Tracy and he had found in London simply put to bed his belief that I was involved, or needed, in whatever intergalactic saga he was involved in. I knew that Elliot was up to something when he announced that he was retiring from music and running for Mayor of London. There was lots of back and forth in those days about what should be done with London, if we should rebuild the mangled skeletons, recreate the museums and churches and centres of power, or if we should keep what was there as a kind of memorial or a tourist attraction, or, alternatively, if we should sweep it all away and build a nature reserve on the site. No one was really queuing up to take over, and the government made it clear that the money wasn't there to do much of anything. Elliot won because he said whatever people wanted to hear, held these big rallies soundtracked by his hits, rode a wave of optimism after this awful catastrophe, and somehow pulled in a huge amount of private funding for his clearly insane idea to rebuild London brick by brick. Within a few months, all that goodwill was gone, as it became clear that he was more interested in spending millions of pounds digging up the crash site or erecting bizarre metal structures in the surrounding areas than he was in rebuilding St. Paul's or Big Ben. And he kept it up for years, through the lawsuits, the attempts to oust him, all of it, and then, one day, he simply disappeared. As I record this, It's been about 5 years since he was last seen, and I am wholly convinced that he will never be seen again. For the longest time, I never spoke about any of this. The army, the drugs, the asteroid, Elliot. Part of the reason for that was a fear of being seen a certain way, as crazy, as an addict, a fool, a coward. And part of it was, I think, that I didn't know how to square it, how to make sense of the first 8 or so years of my adult life. And what changed wasn't that I suddenly figured it all out. I guess it was more that I finally accepted that, yes, these things had happened to me, these strange and terrible things, but I was still here. Elliot witnessed something incredible with me, plunged me into the darkest point of my life and then saved me from it, tried to turn me into a prop in his delusions, and ultimately abandoned me. I'll probably never fully understand it, but that's something to surrender to, not something to run from. Because once you surrender to the truth, you start living with it. This is Oliver Logue, and you have been listening to Mono-Logues.